The City of the Dead was originally thought up as a TV series by writer George Baxt, with the screenplay for the film starting out as a pilot script. It was shopped around until producer Milton Subotsky got a hold of it and rewrote it to be a movie script instead, making it longer, such as adding the romantic subplot. Funding was provided by television producer Hannah Weinstein, no relation, and was around £45,000. Due to the controversial nature of the film at the time, the American release cut various lines from the opening scene referencing Lucifer. I kind of didn't know what to expect with this one. This was made in 1960, and despite the 60s being the beginning of the end of the Hays Code, it was still in full effect at that point. So I thought it would be a cheap and bland, albeit decent horror flick. But what I didn't realize until I started watching it was that it was a British production, so there was no worry about it being sanitized. With that, this was a very, very intriguing slow burn that I majorly loved. Whether the inspiration was intentional or not, the film was so much like the Universal horror films of the 1930s and 40s, but an evolved version of them in a way. Like, they took what made those films work and pushed down the cheesier aspects and brought up the scares, like putting in more blood, witches burning at the stake, having a cult, and having the assumed protagonist die halfway through the movie, something that Hitchcock would be more famous for the same year was Psycho. It even had the protagonist in sexy lingerie, as well as having a shit ton of fog and putting those older films to shame in that aspect. It was definitely ballsier than the films at the time, and it was kind of refreshing, but it wasn't bogged down with unnecessary gore or sex or anything like that. Something like the 70s would be famous for, and trust me, I have no problem with that. But with a movie like this, it didn't need that, and it worked. Plus, this film definitely had a much brisker pace than the films of the 30s and 40s, which was unfortunately bogged down by their much slower pace. It was incredibly spooky and atmospheric, and a very well done premise. It was simple yet effective, and despite having a bit more edge in terms of horror, it doesn't bog down by anything unnecessary. This is most definitely a must-watch if you're a fan of spookier and slow burn tales like Dracula and Frankenstein.